Hello, and welcome to the verdant plains and forests of Nagrand. One of the most well-preserved regions that survived Draenor's destruction, Nagrand serves as the primary home of the Mag'har, and it is here where we reunite with Saurfang. This zone is where the most dramatic change thus far will be felt, as I wanted to focus on the Orcs as a people struggling with their past and their desire to grow beyond the shadow of the Legion's plans for them. What this means narratively is that the entire ogre story has been gutted or repurposed for a future video, and the Draenei mostly don't have a presence here. With that said, I hope you will enjoy what I've done here. Let's get started. We arrive in Nagrand and meet Saurfang by a campfire near the road. He's deep in thought and recounts to us that 10 years before the First War, they quarantined the victims of an illness called the Red Pox in a camp that came to be known as Garrosh. The pox was a terrible sickness with a high chance of death, but it proved to be a boon later when everything was falling apart. No one wanted to risk infection, so the town was avoided. The isolation kept them safe from the taint spreading through the rest of the population, a much greater sickness that poisoned the heart and clouded the mind. Saurfang distantly remarks that he made a promise to his wife before she died, Remda, that he would cross the dark portal alone. He doesn't know what his son will think of him, but he doesn't dare get his hopes up. Thrall arrives with Nazgral at his side, and Korkron on a guard in tow, and Saurfang rises to greet them. The warchief is mesmerized by the beauty of Nagrand after travelling through the wastes of Hellfire and the dour, haunted mists of Terakar. He congratulates Saurfang on a job well done, and we set off to meet the rest of the Mag'har, with Saurfang leading the way. We arrive at Garrosh, and a guard ushers us through the gate, warned by the village in Hellfire of our arrival. In-game, Garrosh is more or less a village, but here it would be large enough to be considered a small city, a melting pot of different clan members who survived their infection with the Red Pox. The place is thronged with refugees, most of them injured, some delirious, and it's struggling to provide food and shelter for everyone. Despite its beauty, there are many problems in Nagrand. In the Great Hall at the centre of Garrosh, we find the local leaders in conference: Garrosh Hellscream, who leads the Orcs of Garrosh, Joran Deadeye, who leads the Mag'har Bleeding Hollow, and Thura, a warrior who represents the leader of Sunspring Village, an elderly shaman called Goshe Dreambinder. Pride of place is reserved for Great Mother Gaia, the Mag'har spiritual leader and the matriarch who took care of the sick and dying when their quarantine-turned home first formed. She sits in a wheelchair, ailing but nonetheless lively, and welcomes us to Garrosh. She addresses Saurfang directly, telling him that his son has grown up strong and proud with a noble heart. Saurfang haltingly asks her where he can find Dranosh, and she tells him the boy is living in a village on the northern shores of Lake Sunspring, to which he nods gratefully. Thrall thanks her for the welcome and announces himself as the warchief of the new horde and the son of Durotan. Gaia expresses shock and joy, revealing herself to be Thrall's grandmother from Durotan's side of the family. This stuns him momentarily, as he thought he had no family left. Silent until now, Garrosh dourly remarks that it won't be long for that to come true. With a firm admonishment to Garrosh, Gaia eases Thrall's concerns, telling him that they will have time enough to talk, but right now their people are suffering and need help. Garrosh is clearly skeptical of anything improving and walks out, leaving us to speak with the Great Mother, Joran, and Thura. People who actually read all the books will know Thura from Stormrage, where she helped free Malfurion from the Emerald Nightmare using the Axe of Cenarius, previously wielded by her uncle Broxagar, the Red, Varok Saurfang's brother. I'm introducing her here because I want to, there's no deeper explanation for it. At the Great Mother's prompting, Joran explains that his people were attacked by something horrific 2 nights ago. The creatures came under the cover of darkness, attacking with the ferocity and mercilessness of starved animals. Thura adds that people have been going missing on a semi-regular basis for months now, and Sunspring has experienced these creatures prodding at their boundaries more often than any other settlement in Nagrand. She thought for sure the attack would come for them, not the Bleeding Hollow. When asked by Thrall what attacked them, Joran describes creatures similar to orcs, but long and gangly, with eyes like cold, dead stars, moving with the shadows as if partially made of them. Saurfang mutters the word Ruknaku, and Thrall asks him to elaborate if he knows what Joran is talking about. Gaia is the one who elaborates instead, explaining that before the Great Corruption, every so often someone would be exiled from the clans, whether for dishonorable conduct, crime, or crueler reasons. They would wander for years and some would settle in a remote area, living solitary lives as hermits, but for whatever reason many ended up disappearing entirely, never to be seen again. For as long as she can remember, their people have had stories of things that prowl on the darkest nights, creatures that were once orcs but are now known as Ruknaku, the Pale Ones, ravenous, mad monsters that snatch lone travelers and misbehaving children. Saurfang finally speaks up, recalling an experience he had. I encountered them once when I was much younger, on a hunting trip. There was a particular weald in Garrosh where the Botani did not tread. We foolishly believed it was abandoned. They attacked during the night. With shadow, claw, and tusk, those creatures ripped 2 of my friends to pieces and rendered the third unable to walk. I fought like a cornered animal and let the bloodlust take over. I was afraid. Animals and people alike can be driven off with enough pain, but these things seemed to enjoy it. When they were all dead, I carried my friend back home and recounted the battle. The search party found no bodies, but plenty of blood and drag marks. Whatever they are, they waste nothing they can eat. On that grim note, we head out to investigate the attack, but for those interested, there would be a stay a while and listen conversation between Thrall and Gaia. She would express relief at his survival and reveal the name his parents intended for him, Goel. Thrall would seem unsure how to feel about it, stating that he needs time to process and focuses on helping his people for now. We arrive at the Bleeding Hollow settlement of Nokugon, meaning Blood Rise, which in this version replaces Kilsarrow Fortress and expands into the old Terakar location from there. Dark fire still clings to some of the buildings, though many remain standing and salvageable. Blood stains the ground, claw and drag marks smearing it towards collapsed tunnels from beneath the village, the corpses of Joran's clan consumed by the earth. Pressing deeper into the gutted village, periodic vibrations and strange movements in the ground follow us, subsiding when we eventually find a terrified survivor by the name of Kilrath. Yes, the same Kilrath bravely cowering in the bushes when you investigate the Bleeding Hollow ruins in-game. Here, he's found partially buried under a collapsed house, and while we begin digging him out, Kilrath recounts what he saw the night of the attack and during the aftermath. They were orcs, but gangly, horrible wretches the colour of bone, and eyes like burning ice. They called to the shadows, and the shadows answered, gave them power like nothing else. Kilrath adds that being buried obscured him. The creatures had plenty of meat to choose from, so they didn't search for more. He begins to say something about Sunspring, but he's cut off. The Pale Ones burst out of the ground and attack with huge claws made of shadow, curved, gouging things you'd find on an anteater, suited for digging through hard earth and stone, and more than capable of gutting an unfortunate target. The group survives and finishes digging Kilrath out of the debris, whereupon Thrall begins to give him some healing and prompts him to finish what he was saying. While he was hidden, Kilrath overheard the Pale Ones speaking in Orcish, which he found strange because the other ones didn't. They spoke in something else, a foul tongue that made him uneasy to hear it. Perhaps they knew that he was there, but expected him to die soon and enjoyed the fear their words inspired. The monsters planned to attack Sunspring, and soon. Fearing for his son, Saurfang runs off to warn Sunspring of the attack, and Thrall follows, telling us to meet up with them once Kilrath is safely returned to Garrosh. On the way back, Kilrath confides in us how frightened he was of those things, and that shames him as a warrior. Fear can be as deadly as any blade, and he thought himself better than that. But lying under the rubble, pinned and helpless with the sound of the Pale Ones devouring his kin, he admits to weeping. We return him to Garrosh and inform Garrosh of the situation. He responds coldly that it would have been kinder to let Kilrath die. Now he has to live with his failure as they all wither away in shame. He doesn't seem worried about Sunspring potentially being attacked, telling us to do whatever we want even if it won't change anything for the better. Leaving him to his pessimism for now, we rendezvous with Saurfang and Thrall just outside Sunspring. Things seem okay, but Saurfang hesitates to approach, and Thrall asks him why. Doesn't he want to see his son? Of course. I haven't seen him since he could fit in my hands. An emote would depict him looking down at his hands, palms up and slowly clenching them. But these hands, you were too young, Thrall. You've suffered for the sins my generation committed. My hands are drenched in blood, innocent blood. I have slain children with these hands, and howled like a beast in glorious revelry at the act. Of course I want to see my son, but will he see his father, or the monster I so readily became? Thrall tells him that he never would have done any of that if not for the demon blood. That is what made him a monster, not what resides in his heart. Saurfang shakes his head, remarking that the blood might have been the catalyst, but that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't bring back the slaughtered innocents, or ease the trauma of those who suffered to be told, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, I couldn't stop myself." Heading into Sunspring, we overhear Thura talking to Dranosh in the Great Hall, and the two appear to be good friends. Dranosh isn't sure how to feel, and Thura encourages him to be honest, making it clear that he knows what's coming. The conversation dies as we enter, and a cutscene plays. We see Thrall and Saurfang enter the hall, and when Dranosh looks at him, Saurfang freezes at a loss, and barely gets out his son's name. Dranosh frowns and approaches, his intentions unclear. When he stands in front of Saurfang, they are the same height, and very similar looking if not for their skin and Saurfang's greying hair. Saurfang remarks wistfully that Dranosh has his mother's eyes, and we see a split shot where both he and Remda are shown to have rich golden brown eyes like polished amber, unlike the clear, sickly shade of yellow Saurfang possesses, another leftover from the demon blood. The expression on Dranosh's face softens, and just as Saurfang begins to apologize, Dranosh hugs him. Stunned, Saurfang can only stand and stare, his arms half lifted in a reflexive move to defend himself from attack, but slowly he relaxes and wraps those arms around his child. His brow furrows, and tears spill down his face with no move to hide or wipe them away. Dranosh, also crying, stiffly says that he thought he was alone. They both did. Thura is his cousin, which makes her Saurfang's niece, but both her parents died after she was left at Garrosh. Saurfang opens his arm and beckons her in, which Thura appears surprised by, but accepts, receiving the kind of fatherly hug she likely hasn't had for most of her life. After the cutscene, Thrall warns them of the Pale One's plan to attack the village. Dranosh agrees that while he and his father need time to talk, there are more immediate concerns right now. We help him and Thura shore up Sunspring's defenses, part of which involves helping Gaucher Dreambinder call upon the spirits of Lake Sunspring for aid. We go through a nighttime scenario to protect the village from increasingly dangerous Pale Ones, eventually repelling the attack with minimal casualties. With Sunspring secure, we return to Garrosh with Dranosh and Thura in tow, and report our success, but Garrosh barely reacts to this news, remarking that our efforts only slow down the inevitable decline. Frustrated by that response, Thrall wonders if the elements can provide any insight to the Pale One's activities, and at the Great Mother's urging we head to the Throne of the Elements. This nexus of power resides to the north, and it was formed from the Skull of Grond, a massive titan creation that did battle with the Spore Mounds, the parasitic progenitors of the sentient plant creatures found all across Old Draenor. To that end, since this area remained relatively intact, it should look more like a skull is embedded in the earth, and the size of it would be colossal. At first you'd mistake the teeth of its lower jaw for stone pillars, but looking up reveals that the supposedly rocky overhang that sticks out of the cliffs is actually the bones and teeth of an upper jaw. It wouldn't be clear at first glance, but once you notice it, the size of the creature it implies would be staggering. And yes, I know that they wrote an explanation in Volume 2 of Chronicles as to why the throne doesn't look like the skull of a living mountain, but A, that came out in 2017, 3 years after Warlords of Draenor introduced us to the entire concept of primals and breakers battling for dominance, and B, they basically threw the Chronicle books out the window for the sake of writing convenience, so I don't see why I should care, and finally C, half-buried skull of primordial mountain demigod from which the orcs ultimately descended and learned shamanism through is much cooler than discount Stonehenge. We meet a council of 4 orc shamans instead of 2 orc and 2 broken, and speak to the Furies who embody Draenor's elemental forces, fractured as they are. Communing with Gordog, the Fury of Earth, Thrall translates a troubling revelation. The Fury tells us that something terrible is lurking beneath Nagrand, an ancient otherworldly thing not native to the planet. The ogres unearthed it beneath Highmole in the early days of the Gorian Empire, and spilled so much blood to seal it away that the earth surrounding its prison remains sanguine to this day. The ogres called it the Burrowing Darkness. His memory of the creature is muddled thanks to its corruptive influence, and he can't tell us anything more, but he knows of someone who explores the cursed places his kind cannot tread, lest they want to risk falling under the creature's power. He tells us to seek out a shaman called Umran, and that we will find her in Rodamar. Saurfang expresses unease, and Thrall questions him as he wasn't raised on Draenor and doesn't know all the finer details of its history. Saurfang tries to answer but trails off into uncomfortable silence. This prompts Thura to explain that Rodamar is a settlement to the south populated by both orcs and Draenei, and the children of orcs and Draenei. They call themselves Drizzarin, or Children of Draenor. In this version of events, we'd learn that the Orcish name for their home is Kazumgar, derived from the Ogrenum Dorgar, meaning the Free Earth and the Known Earth, respectively. Seriously, it's just really odd that we never learn what the orcs called their native planet. It's always what the Draenei called it. Even Saurfang's own son is named in such a way to incorporate the Draenei name of their homeworld, which feels insidiously colonial. On that note, Dranosh no longer means Heart of Draenor, but something along the lines of Noble's Heart, carrying all of Saurfang's hope that his son will live free of the depravity the Legion brought them to. Anyway, we're getting off track here. Thrall is surprised and questions how this happened, as he was under the impression that there was never any fondness between their people. Saurfang sighs and finds his voice. Our people coexisted long before the Legion came. The Draenei spent 1,000 years on our world, and they avoided us, as we avoided them. But over the generations, curiosity brewed, and every so often a few of our people paired off. No one was quite sure how to respond to these couplings, and they usually ended up on the outskirts of society, no matter what side they attempted to stay with. It wasn't until a blade master known as Rodam Frostspite took a Rangari as her mate that there was a place for them. Dranosh nods and adds that the village has lasted for over 100 years. While many of the younger generation are products of the violence perpetrated during the Orcs' corruption, the majority of Rodamar's history is that of people who willingly chose each other. Needless to say, their place in the social fabric between Orcs and Draenei is complicated. See, in this version of the world, Rodamar replaces the Kuranai settlement of Talar, as their home is now firmly in Zangarmarsh. Something that always kind of bugged me is that almost all the instances of orc hybrids are heavily implied or outright stated to have come about through orcish violence. And while, yeah, that can happen, obviously, the idea that a good chunk of them wouldn't be from loving or at least consenting pairings shows a very shallow and fucked up understanding of how people mix and interact. I could go off on a tangent about how all kinds of mixed folk should be more common than they are in Azeroth because people are people, but that should really be in a different video, so we're going to move on. One last thing, Hala would exist here as a trading post between the Orcs and the Drizzarin. The gang, consisting of Saurfang, Thrall, Dranosh, Thura, and the Adventurer, head to Rodamar and arrive to a frosty reception. The Drizzarin have suffered attacks as well and are wary of unfamiliar faces. We announce that we need to speak to Umran, and this brings out Lantressa, the great-grandson of Rodam Frostbite. Rather than a mildly off-color orc, here Lantressa would have distinctly blue skin, glowing eyes, and the subtle ridges of a brow crest. Other Drizzarin would have a different mix of qualities. Carrying the icy blade of his great-grandmother, Lantressa demands to know what we Manari want with his people, directing this Draenic word at Saurfang and Thrall. Saurfang understands what it means as he falls silent in apparent shame. Dranosh steps forward and states our business, explaining everything up to now, and that we need to speak to Umran, Lantressa's daughter. Lantressa is ready to send us packing, but Umran emerges to speak for herself. She is more orcish in appearance like her father, but possesses a tail to go with her glowing eyes and brow crest. Arguing in our favour, Umran presses the urgency of the problems they face. There is something horrendous fighting to exert its vile influence on all of them. The Pale Ones are merely a symptom of a much greater evil. Reluctantly, Lantressa allows us entry to Rodema, but reminds us that should we bring harm to his people, he will bring all his fury to bear against us. We help set things right for the Drazarans, securing their borders, checking in with scouts to gain more information about the Pale Ones, and gathering extra supplies. Through this, we'd see how their heritage is reflected not just in appearance and architecture, but culturally as well. As an example, their faith would be primarily shamanistic, but there'd be something adjacent to light worship folded into it, a reverence for Outland Sun, personified as the Dawn Mother, or Magrolak in Orcish. There would be a few of those stay a while and listen conversations between the characters at this point, notably Thrall talking to Lantressa with curiosity but also care, and Saurfang talking to Dranosh. The latter conversation would be an attempt to properly begin bridging the time and distance that kept them apart. Saurfang is awkward and stilted, afraid that Dranosh is somehow unsure of what he became, and once he realizes he'll spurn his father like the monster he fears himself to be deep down. But Dranosh assuages that fear, remarking that he knows his people's nature and it is not that of demons. If Saurfang really was that monster, he wouldn't have saved Dranosh by hiding him in Garrosh. His love for his son was powerful enough to break through the haze of demon blood, just long enough for it to matter. Once Rodema is more secure, Umran explains that it used to be the Pale Ones were far more common in the western mountains past Oshugun, but now they're congregating in the ruins above and below Highmall and have begun launching attacks from the cave systems throughout Halani Basin. Either something drew them down there, or they were pushed out. We head out to investigate these leads with her and find that both are true, in that something is calling to them from Highmall, and most worryingly, a demonic incursion pushed them out of their mountain homes. The demons serve as a warning of things to come, as they clearly aren't aligned with Illidan, and we do what we can to weaken their foothold, but they are already dug in deep through the area. After scouting the ruins of Highmall and the Halani Basin, we find that the catacombs beneath Highmall are inaccessible from the surface, but the Pale Ones clearly have a way through in their tunnels. Stopping their attacks will require delving deep beneath Nagrand's surface, and for that we need support. We return to Garrosh and bring everything we know to Garrosh, which Thrall hopes will finally stir him, and a cutscene plays. Garrosh is briefly roused by the news of demons in Nagrand, and looks off to the mountains in the distance in which they plot and scheme, before letting out a depressive grunt. He turns away to the fire burning in the centre of town, and remarks that it was foolish to think they could escape. They are too few to resist falling under the demon's influence again. The Mag'har are destined to rot away in disgrace. Thrall finally becomes angry with him, grabbing Garrosh by the shoulders and turning him around, telling him that his father was a hero who freed them from the blood curse by slaying Manoroth when he stood alone and burdened by the sins of his past. He overcame the pit lord responsible for their corruption and gave their people another chance. Garrosh shoves Thrall's arms away and bellows that Grom was an arrogant, selfish beast who couldn't control himself, who cared more about personal glory than the future of his people, who abandoned Garrosh's mother to die alone and in pain. Grom was a coward, and he damned them. Throwing himself into death's jaws didn't change that. We briefly see Saurfang look away when Garrosh says this, his posture slumped, ashamed, and Thrall yells back, "You are a Hellscream! Your blood is that of peerless warriors, of giants' hearts, and you would see it end, wallowing in misery and self-pity like a snivelling pup? Who are you to call your father a coward?" Garrosh looks at Thrall as if struck, a clarity finally entering his eyes. They stare at each other in furious silence for several long seconds, before Garrosh growls and turns away. He lifts an axe from one of the benches around the fire, staring at the edge, then his reflection. He scowls. He turns to face Thrall and Saurfang with bright, fiery eyes, and vows to see both the demons and the Pale Ones driven into memory. With help from Lantressa, Umran, Garrosh, Thrall, Dranosh, Saurfang, Thora, and Joran, we enter the story mode of the Underpale Dungeon. The instance will be located just inside a spooky cave in the northwestern end of the Halani Basin. The dungeon would start in the cave systems, traversing through the homes these transformed orcs have built for themselves out of the bones and skin of their kills. Purple and blue fires light the way, and we hear the Pale Ones calling to each other through the tunnels. The deeper we move, the redder the stone and dirt around us becomes, and Thrall comments on how wrong it feels. He knows what the earth feels like, and the ground here is sick, infected somehow. It almost reminds him of the scourge blighting the ground wherever they went. Defeating a dire pale orc blocking our path as the first boss, we pass through a broken wall into the catacombs beneath Hymel, transitioning to Gorian architecture. Similar to the Shadow Labyrinth, the enemies only grow stranger as the group passes on, fighting through enemies who have been warped by the power of their dark burrowing god, and who are all too happy to praise him as they attack. They call him the Pale Father. The second boss would be an archivist type, a shrouded secret keeper surrounded by smoky murals, incense, and scrolls of treated skin. Tasked with preserving all the ritual knowledge and history of the Pale Ones and their connection to this Pale Father. Umran and Joran both search through it, looking for information that might help us face what's ahead. After all, there's little known about this creature the ogres spilled so much blood to seal away. We learn that its real name is Shoragla, and in the earliest days of the planet's formation, it crashed down from the stars, flung from the womb of entropy to spread its mother's darkness. It was smaller than its infinite kin, and that allowed the Pale Father to burrow beneath the earth, away from the gaze of Agramar and his mountainous creations. Long did Shoragla sleep, the echoes of his fitful dreams silently tugging at those who longed for power, who felt abandoned, alone, until he was disturbed by the ogres in their search for that dark power. They rejected his gifts, his terms, his authority, and slaughtered their slaves and lower castes to seal him in place, and while much of his influence was locked down, enough still escaped. Enough to call out to the exiles, wandering the world in search of belonging again. Then the breaking came. The planet shattered and cracked open the prison. Not enough for Shoragla to break free completely, but more than enough for his power and influence to increase dangerously. Joran makes note of the fact that the Archivist was concerned about the prison's stability. When the world broke, it left a significant part of the prison hanging out in open space, and if it were to be damaged enough, they fear Shoragla would slip free. He is a thing of the earth, a burrowing creature. He does not fly or swim. Garrosh growls that they should send that thing to its doom in the void, and the others agree, but Dranosh posits that this creature must be both immensely powerful and intelligent. It will likely try to stop them, but if they could distract it long enough, perhaps the rest of their group can handle the drop. We eventually reach Shoragla and find the old god waiting for us. Garrosh steps forward to speak to it, letting the rest of us sneak around to a large crack on the other side of the room. The twisting nether is visible outside. We begin to work, and a cutscene plays. We see the true scale of this chamber and the being that fills it, shadows gathering like mist around its body. A deep rumble fills the room, vibrating from the old god's chest. It looks like a gigantic badger, covered in tough, pallid skin like a shark, swirling dark patterns like void tentacles covering its back. Its long neck extends, and its spade-like head peers down at Garrosh. 6 eyes in rows of 3, the middle ones most prominent, glow like the corona of a black hole, hungering voids visible only because of the swirl of icy blue light around them. The old god props himself up on forelimbs that end in massive, shovel-like claws the color of freshly polished steel, and he shudders, causing a chorus of hollow clatters as the thick forest of spines that cover his back shake with him, glowing to life with the pulse of a heartbeat.
Primitive little upstarts, you enter the depths and believe yourselves capable of mattering. Whatever you achieve here, no matter the outcome, we will win in the end. We are timeless. We were at the beginning, and we will be at the end when the last flicker of light burns course, you could join us and live to see it. You are all so fleeting, so fragile. The void can give you more than the Legion ever could.
Garrosh looks up into the monstrosity's face and snarls that his kind will never bend to demons again, and certainly won't to the void. Shoragla lowers his head to look closer at the young warrior, examining him, and Garrosh is barely larger than its biggest eye.
I know your blood, Hellscream. You should know that we are the Legion's enemy. They fear us. Would you not wish for them to fear your people as well? Avenge what they did to you.
Garrosh combatively asks what he means, and Shoragla explains that long ago the creator of the Burning Legion, Sargeras, came across one of the Void's worlds. He was horrified by their presence, disgusted even, and cleaved that world in two, destroying it in a manner not dissimilar to Kazamgar, Draenor.
The power of my creators terrifies the little godlings who inflict more world with living mountains. The Titans are nothing before the void, even if Sargeras' crusade swallowed every world in the cosmos. He is not infinite, but we are.
Garrosh dismisses the old god's words, standing firm that his people will not be used as weapons again. Shoragla laughs.
If your people could not resist falling to the Legion's corruption, the Legion exists because they fear our power. How could you hope to defeat them without us, little Hellscream? Would it be so terrible a bargain?
Garrosh is quiet for a moment before his eye flicks to see Saurfang motioning that they're ready. He grins wide, a bloodthirsty expression fit for a hungry wolf, and howls, sinking his axe into the eye before him. Shoragla reels back, more annoyed than pained, and shakes his head, sending the axe flying. Before he can act, we see Thrall, Joran, and Umran casting in tandem, and the break explodes out into the nether, dropping the floor out from under the old god, and the scene ends. At this point, we would transition to a fight where Shoragla is clinging to the broken edges, trying not to fall in as powerful wind elementals attempt to push him the rest of the way. We attack his arms until he is finally forced to let go and drifts into the open space of the twisting nether, flailing, howling, and slowly growing fainter. We regroup, and Thrall commends Garrosh for his bravery in the face of that creature, something Garrosh seems to have trouble accepting before he awkwardly nods. He appears unused to praise, perhaps acclimated to the idea that he wouldn't escape Grum's disgrace. Nonetheless, relieved to have survived this encounter, Joran teleports everyone back to the surface. With the threat of the Pale Ones dealt with, we'd be able to find Joran, Garrosh, Thrall, and Saurfang back in Garadar. Joran would give us a questline to restore the Bleeding Hollow clan's home, giving us insight into how the clan functions under uncorrupted leadership. Garrosh would be a source of Mag'har dailies, sending us to perform strikes against the demons in the west, with great emphasis placed on his utter hatred and disgust for their kind. He'd seem far more energized and focused than when we first met him. We'd find Saurfang with Dranosh and Thura, with more conversations between them and the implication that Dranosh and Thura want to return to Azeroth. Thura to explore, and Dranosh to fight alongside his father. And finally, Thrall would be found with Gaia, and staying a while to listen would result in hearing him decide how to respond to his birth name. He would reason that those close to him may know him as Goel, but his people, the Horde, and the world of Azeroth know him as Thrall, the unchained slave who freed his people from a slow, wallowing death in captivity and led them to a new home. That name carries weight, and he will continue to shoulder it for as long as the Horde needs him. The rest of the zone questlines would involve fighting against Nessingwary's ego-driven poaching of Nagrand's wildlife, as if the Mag'har don't have enough to deal with on their broken home, helping out Rodamar, learning more about them and their mutually beneficial relationship with the Windy Reed village of Lost Ones, and focusing on their continued survival and attempts to heal from collective trauma. Again, it just feels oddly cruel to write them off as evil, violent savages who need to be put down, considering what they went through to get there. The final major questline outside the main story would involve easing the restless spirits of Oshugun, who have been disturbed by void activity driven by the Pale Ones. We'd learn more about Orcish spiritualism, their funerary practices, and Oshugun would not, in fact, be an alien spaceship that the stupid natives mistook for a holy mountain. I mean, how the fuck did they clear that? Did the team think that was clever somehow? Jesus. Anyway. With that, we are finally done with Nagrand. This got way longer than I meant it to, but I suppose that's what happens when I'm not piggybacking off the existing zone story and get carried away. Special shout out to my supporters on Patreon, who are all very handsome people, and especially to my newest patrons, Mechfried and Fetid Heels. Thank you for watching, please take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time as we hike to the jagged peaks of Blade's Edge Mountains.